Hello and welcome. My name is Tom. This is the Enthusiasm Project, Season 9, Episode 4, with a lot of fun in store. So, let's go for it. Today, as we talk about choosing the right camera, I wanted to go back to something that seems pretty basic. I feel like with a lot of the discussions I have with, people who listen to the podcast, people on the YouTube channel, just my own friends, stuff that I look up and am interested in, a lot of it is sort of beyond picking a camera. And I then realized that there's so much confusion about these basics. This is sort of what I was talking about earlier in the season, a few episodes ago, where I think it's easy to skip over the fundamentals. And what's worse than that is there are people who maybe have questions about some of those basics, but because there's not a lot of discussion about it, might feel scared to ask about it. And their questions never really get answered. And so I wanted to cover some of the essentials. Choosing the right camera, it can be so confusing because there's so many options out there. So that's something that I want to dive into today. I do have some specific recommendations. So if you're somebody who's looking for a new camera or you're looking to get into a new camera system and you want some recommendations, I definitely want to give you some specific things that you could look up and check out. But I also don't want to spend too much time on that because very quickly that could become dated as soon as a company comes out with the next greatest camera ever. That might not be as relevant. Rather, I would like to explain what I look for in a camera and maybe some of the processes, almost like a flow chart to go through if you're looking for one to help you figure out what you need and the direction to be pointed in. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Super excited about that because I don't know if you know this or not, I really like talking about cameras. But before we do that, I want to talk about microphones to let you know what I'm using today in case you're listening. Last week, I used the Lewitt LTT 440 Pure, LCT 440 Pure, and I really liked the way that sounded. I also am currently working on a video where I recorded the video with that microphone. Very impressed with it. Super excited to do a video about it and a video that compares it to the 240. But for today, we're going to an old classic. We're using the SM7B, just running directly into the Rodecaster Pro II on the SM7B preset. With nothing else changed. There's nothing else happening. I really love the presets in the Rodecaster Pro II, and especially the SM7B one. It's cool that it has one, right? Like it's a Rode product that has a Shure preset. That's pretty awesome. And I wanted to give the SM7B some love because it feels like maybe for the past 6 months or so, I've only been using this as a comparison microphone. For, here's the Sona, here's the Ethos, here's all these other microphones. How do they compare to the SM7B? Maybe here's strengths that they have over the SM7B. And I was sort of feeling like, it's time to go back to the SM7B, not compare it to anything else, but just use it and enjoy it because it's such a good microphone. So that's what I wanted to do today, back on the trusty old Shure SM7B. And I'm thinking, at least in my headphones right now, sounds pretty awesome. Plus, I can move it around. Like right now, I'm grabbing and shaking the microphone. You can't even hear it because of the incredible built-in shock mount and the way it rejects handling noise. Definitely a lot of benefits to the SM7B. Rode did announce this week the NT1 5th generation, which, to be honest with you, I didn't know we were on a 4th generation NT1. I thought it was just the NT1. But anyway, 5th generation NT1, which I'm hoping to be able to try out soon. That should be pretty cool because it's, improved NT1, which I think the NT1 sounds amazing, but somehow it's improved, and I do think it sounds incredible from the reviews that I've heard. But it's also a USB combo mic, which is very interesting, and the USB functionality has 32-bit float audio, which is super cool. So I would love to record a podcast with that on the USB-C setting to see if I can clip or not. And I would love it with Rode going down the road of 32-bit float audio. I'd definitely love to see if maybe there's a firmware update in store for the Rodecaster Pro II that includes that, because the ability to plug in any mic, not that the SM7B would clip, but some other mics, and especially some condensers and things that can potentially clip, being able to use the Rodecaster and never, ever, ever clip your audio no matter what, that would be, that'd be pretty amazing. So I'd love to see if that's something that could happen at some point. I think that's pretty dang exciting over there. But If you want to know more about 32-bit float audio, check out my video about the Zoom F2 recorder. It's titled like "This tiny recorder made my audio so much better," because it's about the Zoom F2, but it sort of explains my journey in trying to understand 32-bit float audio, which is not nearly as complicated as it sounds. And speaking of other videos, the video that just came out most recently as I'm recording this, as you're listening to this, if you're listening to it the day that it came out, was a beginner's guide to choosing the right camera lens. So it's almost like a companion to this episode. This is about cameras. That's about camera lenses. And I really wanted to make that because I had some people even say, I don't think this video is going to do that well because, if someone's already buying an interchangeable lens camera, they probably wouldn't consider themselves a beginner and they know what they want, which is 100% not true. I know you would think that maybe, and maybe for some of us that's the case. I know when I got my first DSLR that changed lenses, I knew nothing about lenses. Over the years, I've had so many friends and family members and students who have access to or buy a camera where you can change the lens, and they don't know what lens to do where to go from there. So that video is a nice explanation of what to look for in a lens, the different components of a lens, and then some recommendations for how to find the right lens for you. And then this episode is a nice companion because it's about the other part of that, which is the camera itself. So let's talk about different types of cameras. Let's dive right in and talk about different types of cameras as they exist today. I'm recording this at the early 2023, so there's a lot out there. Phones are obviously the most popular cameras in the world, literally. At the time I'm recording this, your phone is the main camera for most of us, and that's cool. There are point and shoot cameras, there are interchangeable lens cameras, and then within that, there are things that are more specialized. So I want to focus not so much on phones and point and shoots, but I don't want to leave them out of the discussion. Obviously, phone cameras are great because they're the ones that are with us most of the time, and they're really good now. I've been using an iPhone XR for several years. I don't know, it's a 3 or 4 year old phone at this point. It only has one camera. I know how shameful to only have one camera bump on the back of your phone, but it's been fine. Like I know it's not the best camera in the world, but it's pretty darn good. It gets the job done. And then over Christmas, Heather's family got us new phones, which was like the nicest gift. That's probably the priciest gift I've ever been given. It was kind of insane. So they gave us iPhone 14 Pros, which have the big, like the really, really nice cameras and 3 lenses on the back. I don't know if it's more of a phone or more of a camera at this point. I'm not someone who's that into phones. I'm not someone who really likes filming with phones or anything, but having a phone that has like a dedicated, really good cameras has been kind of amazing. And the ability to like take what are really nice photos and videos, super stabilized video also, has been pretty awesome. So like what that means to me is it really seems like point and shoot cameras are the things, as much as I've loved them and had so many of them over the years, a point and shoot camera probably doesn't have a lot of room in the world. Like if you're buying, one of the $250 point and shoots, probably your phone is better, or putting that money towards a new phone is a better way to go. Probably the exception to a point and shoot, when I say a point and shoot camera, I'm talking about a camera, that looks sort of like a traditional digital camera, but you can't change the lens on it. The exceptions to that, I think, would be the Sony ZV-E1 and there's the other one. I forget what it's called. It's like the E1, but it's got a different lens on it. It's a little less expensive. Those, I think, are maybe the 2 exceptions because they're geared so heavily towards video, and they have some benefits over a phone. Even though they have small sensors, their sensors are bigger than a phone, so it's easier to get better image quality from that. They have better lenses than a phone would. They have, the flip out screen, better autofocus, and they're much easier to use. They're kind of designed in a lot of ways to also be used as webcams and for streaming. And so those are great. Heather has had a ZV-1 for a couple of years now. It's a great camera. It's just so reliable. Sometimes it is nice to have a separate purpose-specific device for things. Like maybe your phone's cool, but it's also got like a million other things on it. So sometimes having like, this is just my camera. It only does things the camera's supposed to do. It excels at that one thing. It's a terrible phone because it's a camera. But, sometimes that's the way to go. For the sake of today, though, I want to move into interchangeable lens cameras because I think it's going to be hard for anyone to buy. The worst thing that's going to happen when you buy a point and shoot camera is you're going to spend some money and end up with something you don't really use that often, which sucks. It is a bummer, but it's not really the end of the world. And a lot of times you can find some kind of use for them or find someone who would like, if you buy a point and shoot and you never use it, you probably have a friend or a relative who would want to use it and you can give it to them. So it's easy to get some use out of those. When you get into the world of interchangeable lens cameras, not only do the cameras themselves become more complex, they become more expensive, and the whole thing can kind of become more overwhelming. And at the rate that cameras have been released in the past couple of years, it's like you would think that every few months or every few weeks even, there's like the new biggest breakthrough and everything else is now garbage because some new amazing thing came out. So I want to go through that mess a little bit there. So let's assume that you're looking for a camera with an interchangeable lens. Let's focus on that. Focus on that. So you might have a brand in mind. Like you might already know, if you already have a system, I guess I should say, if you're already somehow in the Sony system, the Canon system, whatever, you might then be leaning one direction or the other. And that's fine. And there's options. There's no bad cameras. That's something I've said many times. As long as you're getting the main brands, you're getting Sony, Canon, Panasonic, Nikon, Fuji, like you're not going to get a bad camera. If you go beyond those main brands into bargain bin brands and things, you're probably going to get a bad camera. And of course, there's premium stuff like Leica or Hasselblad. But if you're going to buy a Leica, it's unlikely that you'd be listening to this episode about choosing the right camera because you are probably beyond that if you're going to drop that kind of cash on a camera. So what I would recommend, though, if you're jumping in, you want to get a new camera, you might be swayed by what your friends use, what people you watch or listen to use. I would definitely recommend, and speaking from experience, taking the time to look at what you actually want and then seeing if something out there suits your needs the best. That it sounds easy, and part of it, you're going to probably make a mistake. Chances are if you buy a camera and you use it a lot in 6 months, you're going to be using features of it and things about it that you wouldn't have necessarily put on a list. Like I can tell you that 4K 120, filming 120 frames per second in 4K full frame was not really, it wasn't really a feature I was looking for when I was buying a new camera back in 2021. But then the camera I bought had it. And since then, it has become an amazing part of my workflow that I love, but it's nothing I was trying to buy at the time. So that might happen. But I think, some of the basics are really important. Are you going to do more photo or more video? Are you going to do a lot of streaming? Do you want to connect the camera to a computer? Do you want to use the built-in memory card a lot? Are you going to be in, crazy adverse weather conditions? Do you want built-in stabilization? Are you somebody who uses manual focus lenses, or do you want really good autofocus? Are you going to be running your camera into a monitor or a recorder, which would mean you would need like a full-size HDMI for the sake of reliability, maybe even bumping up to a camera that has an SDI output versus a tiny micro HDMI? Those kinds of things, it's different for everybody, and there's a whole bunch of things to consider. But if you think about, I want this camera, this is what I see myself doing with it, this is what I want to use it for, what are some of the things I need to do that? That's a good place to start. Like have your wish list of non-negotiables. The camera must have this, and then maybe a wish list of this would be nice, and other things maybe you don't care about or aren't even thinking of. Going back to when I ended up switching from Sony to Canon, there's 3 episodes of podcasts that cover that whole transition, so I don't need to go into too much depth. But to sum it up, if you haven't heard those or it's been a while, I had been shooting Canon since 2007. I really wanted to stick with Canon. At that time, in early 2021, Canon didn't have anything that was really suiting my needs, and I was at the point where I was going to compromise on what I wanted, and I decided, no, I'm going to take the time to actually like look at what's out there. And I tried, I was looking at Panasonic cameras, but I really wanted good autofocus. At the time, Panasonic did not have good autofocus. I was looking at Blackmagic because I do mostly video, and the Blackmagic cameras are an insanely good value for the money. But again, it was the focus. It was the focus and the lack of any forward-facing screens. As much as the cameras are really fun to use and give amazing results and can do so much cool stuff, I knew as a one-person crew, it wasn't going to be the right camera for me. I was kind of steering away from Sony because there was sort of like this fanaticism around the brand, and it was a big turnoff, honestly. But when I looked at what I wanted really good autofocus. I wanted full frame 4K. I wanted no recording limits. I wanted no overheating issues. I wanted good battery life. I wanted a flip out screen. Sony was kind of the one that checked all those boxes for me. And by the end of that year, I had 3 Sony cameras. So it definitely worked. But that doesn't mean you need to get a Sony camera. A Canon might be the better one for you. A Nikon, and things have changed since then as well. Like there are new options out there. So the point in telling you that is not to say I ended up with Sony, so you should also end up with Sony. It's to say I didn't think I was going to end up with Sony. In my mind, I was going to get a Canon camera. But when I stepped back and objectively looked at what I wanted, what was important to me in a camera, and what cameras offered those things that actually made that available at the time, it was only Sony. That was really the only option. And I'm really glad that that's what I went with. And so that's something that I definitely recommend that you do. And look at the lens system too. You might find a camera body that seems pretty amazing, but then if you look at what lenses are available for it, especially if it's not one of the more popular brands, you might find yourself realizing, I could be limited. Even if you don't have a ton of plans currently to get a lot of lenses, it's never a good thing to limit yourself that way. So if you notice like, wow, this whatever sort of niche brand seems pretty cool, but there's only a handful of lenses and they're all really expensive, it might be worth not getting that one and getting something that has a lot more lens availability. All the big, Canon, Nikon, Sony. I'm not too familiar with Panasonic lenses, but I think they're relatively easily adaptable too. You're not going to be super limited, especially if you choose, this is maybe where Canon is not doing great right now, but if you choose a company that lets third parties also make lenses for it, like Sigma or Tamron, especially if they can use autofocus, that opens up a ton of doors. So that stuff I think is very important. So first step, choosing the right camera. Objectively assessing what your needs are and what your non-negotiables are, the things that are most important for you, which probably do include things like autofocus, things like resolution. At this point, if you're doing a lot of video, I would definitely recommend a 4K workflow. 1080 is fine, but if you're buying a camera, you're planning to use it for a while. Back in 2017, I made a video saying I didn't think 4K was super necessary, and that was true at the time. In 2023, I think it's a very good idea to look at 4K. It's a lot more manageable than it used to be. Computers can process it a lot better, but that's also something to consider is what computer you have to edit the footage on. If you have an older computer, in the world of Apple, that would be anything pre-M series chips. So if you have any of the Intel ones, it'll be important to know whether or not you'll be able to edit the footage smoothly in a way that's not going to make you tear your hair out while you're working with your computer. If you have any of the Apple M1, M2, whatever, M series chips, you're fine with pretty much anything that we're going to be talking about today. And then the other things to look at is what you're going to use the camera for. Are you going to do mostly video? Are you going to do mostly photos? Are you planning to do a combination of both? Because there are cameras that are really, really specialized. Most cameras, interchangeable lens cameras you would buy now can do both. Can take some photos and can take some video. But most of them are more specialized in one or the other. In some cases, like Canon is a good example of, they want to market all of their cameras as being hybrid cameras that can genuinely do both. And they've gotten a lot better at that. They've moved a lot closer. But there's always sacrifices to be made, and Canon always favors photo over video. So anytime they have to make a sacrifice, they will sacrifice a video feature to save a photo feature. they have amazing hybrid cameras, and they've only gotten better in the past couple of years. So it is a good thing, but it's something to be aware of, especially with Canon. Like, the differentiation of features is a little trickier. Sony, on the other hand, I like that they are very clear about their lineups. They have photocentric, video-centric, and hybrid cameras, and it's just clear that that's what they are for. So the very good example is the A7 series. The A7 IV, which is the least expensive full-frame A7 camera that Sony makes at the moment, is a hybrid camera. It's designed to do photo. It's designed to do video. When I say designed to do photo, it has a higher resolution sensor. It's what, actually, I don't remember. I'm looking at my A7 IV right now. I don't remember the sensor resolution. I think it's 33, 35 megapixels, something like that. It's very good for blowing up photos. That high resolution sensor does present some problems for video, especially with things like rolling shutter. On some cameras, it could also present overheating. It can also make it difficult to get low light performance. So the A7 IV is fine in those areas, but it doesn't excel in some of them. But it's a really good photo camera. But then Sony also makes a photo-specific camera. So the A7R series cameras the R is for resolution. They have very high megapixel sensors. They're amazing for photos. They have video features. The A7R5 has some pretty amazing video features. That's a camera that just came out. But everything favors photo over video. The A7S series, the S stands for sensitivity, and that's mainly to do with they have lower resolution sensors that are more sensitive, so you end up with better video image quality, better low light performance, absolutely no overheating, no rolling shutter. They're geared towards video, even though they can still take photos. So that is an important thing to understand. You know, you're probably not going to buy an interchangeable lens camera that can't do both. But if you know you're going to be doing 80% video and 20% photos, it's probably worth looking at a camera that does lean more heavily into video features than photo features. If you're looking for a camera, you know, and the other is true, if you're looking to do more photos and videos, maybe you don't need all these crazy video features. And if you really want, this is my one camera that I'm going to take everywhere, do everything with, I need photos, I need videos, you want to look at something that's going to be a hybrid camera, knowing that there probably are going to be some compromises. The biggest compromises in that do tend to come in terms of like frame rates and resolutions. So, you know, full frame 4K 120 is not something that happens on a lot of higher resolution cameras because those high resolution sensors, if you do full frame, high frame rates, they just burst into flames because it generates so much heat, which is why you can do that on things like the A7S III. You only have 12 megapixels. There's no overheating, no cropping in. And there's a teeny like 1.1 times crop, but that's honestly unnoticeable. I forget it exists. If you're really into video and you're not really interested in photo at all, it might even be worth looking into cinema cameras if you have the budget, although that'd be a pretty big leap for like a first camera. But thinking of things like the Sony FX30, the Sony FX3, those are, I mean, the FX30 is a crop sensor, quote unquote cinema camera, which is a very video centric camera that Sony put out. And the FX3 is just the full frame version of that. The reason you might want to lean towards cinema cameras, those might be exceptions. The form factor favors video a little bit. Some of the menus, some of the features favor video a little bit. And then you can get into other cinema cameras from Sony and other companies. And that's where you end up with things like built-in ND filters. You end up with just controls and buttons and functionality that are kind of geared only towards video. Some of them in the world of cinema cameras, some do not do photos at all. So that's where you just have a video camera. Of course, there's also even things like camcorders. Just go grab a camcorder. I have a video all about modern camcorders if you want to check that out. But you probably know if you need a camcorder. It's probably more like live event, lots of streaming. If you're doing conferences, concerts, live outdoor events and things, that's maybe where a camcorder would come into play. Otherwise, being able to swap out your lens on a much bigger sensor kind of gives some really good results. So let's talk about sensors, because that's the thing that sensors don't always make a lot of sense. Let me tell you, it can be very, very confusing. If you're looking at a camera, what you will probably find, what you'll probably hear is crop versus full frame. And there's some variation throughout this, but basically what that means is a full frame sensor is a digital sensor. That's what, instead of using a roll of film, there's a digital sensor in there. So when the shutter opens or the camera exposes the sensor to light, the sensor takes the light, uses magic, turns it into an image somehow through magic. In the olden days, there didn't used to be a sensor there. There used to be a piece of film there. It would be exposed to light, and then also through magic, it would turn that into an image somehow. A full frame sensor is called full frame because it is the same size as a piece of 35 millimeter film. So in the film days, that's kind of the equivalent. And in early digital camera times, getting to full frame sensors was sort of tricky because they need more resolution, they need more processing power, and it took a while before digital cameras could do that. And so I'm thinking of like the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. That was when it was still like, yeah, digital cameras are cute and they're fun, but professionals are going to be using film. High resolution, high quality only comes from film, nothing else like that. And that flipped probably around 2005, 2006-ish when crop sensor cameras not only got good, but then really good full frame reliable cameras like the Canon 5D and stuff started coming out. And then film, everything flipped and everything leaned much more towards digital. So that's what full frame means. It's a sensor that's the size of a full piece of 35 millimeter film. There are also crop sensor cameras. That's probably what you're going to get if you get a more budget-friendly camera. It's probably going to be a crop sensor camera because they tend to be less expensive. The sensor is smaller than a full-frame camera, but it's still, in the world of cameras, a pretty big sensor. It's way bigger than anything you'll find in a phone or a point-and-shoot camera or anything like that. A crop sensor is still a pretty huge sensor, and the reason it's called crop is the small size means that when you put a lens on it, it's essentially cropping into that field of view more than zero, which is what you would get on a full frame camera. So if you take a 24 millimeter lens and put it on a full frame camera, you're going to be seeing a 24 millimeter field of view. If you take that same 24 millimeter lens, put it on a crop sensor camera, it will probably have a crop of something like 1.6, maybe 1.5, which means it's going to end up being like a 38-ish millimeter field of view. That's what it's going to look like. So you can take the same lens, put it between two cameras, and have totally different field of view. Sometimes you'll hear that called equivalent focal length. So it's something to be aware of if you're switching lenses a lot. It's just something to note, especially as you're buying your camera. The way I see this a lot is I use full frame cameras, and sometimes people see like my regular talking headshot for YouTube videos. They want that, so they buy something like the Sony ZV-E10, which is a crop sensor camera, and then they want the same lens that I have, and they can't get the same field of view, and that's because they're putting the same lens on a crop sensor camera, not a full frame camera, so they actually need a wider lens to get the same field of view that I get on full frame. For me personally, the very first interchangeable lens camera that I had was the Canon XTI in 2007. I forget what that is in I think it was like the 350D or something is what it would have been called, not in the US. It didn't do video. It was just a photo camera, and is a crop sensor camera. And I thought it was great. And then I moved into prime lenses. And as I started learning more about cameras, I started learning really on the photo side of things, but the difference between full frame and crop is not just the sensor size and that field of view, but a full frame sensor will typically be better in low light. There's more pixels. It's a bigger sensor. Bigger sensors usually are more sensitive and better in low light. It's easier to get a shallow depth of field with a full frame sensor. And there's sort of also this like intangible quality. It just sort of looks different. I don't know how to describe it other than if you go through a bunch of photos between full frame and crop, and you start really getting into the minutia, there's like a quality to a full frame sensor that a crop sensor just doesn't have. And so for me, the dream of one day having a full frame camera is something that was there for a long time. And I got my first camera, my first DSLR in 2007. I didn't get a full frame camera until 2015, which is a Canon 6D. I was able to use them at work and stuff prior, which is great, but I didn't get my own until 2015. So 8 years or so before going there. I really love full frame. Once I went full frame, I never wanted to go back to crop sensor, but that doesn't mean crop sensor cameras are bad. They're still amazing quality. They've only gotten better over time, and crop sensors do have a couple of advantages, especially for things like sports and wildlife, because generally speaking, you want more reach for those things. You're probably standing far away from something and wanting to zoom in as far as possible. So being able to kind of what seems like get more reach from a lens by putting it on a crop sensor is really good. This is less of a thing now, but crop sensors used to be better at like higher frame rates, no overheating and stuff because there's a smaller sensor to deal with. It's less of an issue now, but especially for sports, action, wildlife, that kind of stuff, they, for a long time, were a little bit more reliable and a little bit more capable. So, that's why like the Canon 7D, 7 letter D Delta series of cameras were professional bodies, same bodies as the 5D, but a crop sensor, because there are a lot of reasons that even as a pro who could afford a full frame sensor, that you want a crop sensor for your specific needs. So that's something to keep in mind. But most entry-level cameras are probably going to be crop just because it's less expensive. And that's just kind of the way that it is. Although there are, which is insane, some full frame cameras that are well under $2,000 at this point, and that is something I never thought would happen. It's pretty amazing. So in terms of deciding whether you want crop or full frame, if you know what you want, if one makes sense or you've watched reviews or things, that's good. Stick with what you want. If you don't know what you want, I would honestly not stress out about it too much. If you get a crop sensor camera and, oh my gosh, after a while you realize you want a full frame camera, it's fine. Like at some point, your next camera can be a full frame camera. You're not really going to be that limited with your crop sensor. And honestly, learning more about lenses, learning more about lighting, learning more about your camera settings, those are all things that would probably ultimately have a bigger impact than just getting a camera with a different sensor. And crop sensor, full frame don't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. So it's not like one of them is risky to buy versus the other. They seem to be, for the time being, pretty solid options either way. So if you have a preference, put that in your list of non-negotiables. I want a crop sensor. I want a full frame. If you don't have a preference, then don't worry about it. Focus on the other features and budget and things. Now, there are other, speaking of things that are, dead, so to speak, let's talk about DSLRs and Micro Four Thirds. So a DSLR, that's what I mentioned. My first camera was a DSLR. I don't think companies are making them anymore. I could be wrong on that, but I think Canon, Sony, Nikon, I think they've all stopped making DSLRs, which are digital single lens reflex cameras. Basically, mirrored cameras, not mirrorless cameras. And what a DSLR is really a film camera with a digital sensor. A lot of companies just sort of took their designs from film cameras, replaced where you would put the film with a sensor, and that's about it. And what that means is when you look through the viewfinder of a DSLR, you're looking through an optical viewfinder. You're looking at a mirror. There's a mirror that hangs down behind the lens. The light comes into the lens, bounces up the mirror. The mirror's at an angle, and it reflects it up into the viewfinder, really into another mirror, and then into your eye. And so that's what you're looking at. So the camera can be powered off, and you can look through the viewfinder and still see everything or check your lens and everything. When you press the shutter button, that mirror very quickly lifts up. Then the shutter also opens, and then the shutter closes, and the mirror lifts down. And that's what a DSLR is. And that's kind of an old-timey design that has been around for a long time. And there's really nothing wrong with it. It's a great design. It's fine. It's super reliable. As time has gone on, though, and cameras became more digital, I think the shift towards mirrorless, which, believe it or not, gets rid of the mirror, was the result of companies kind of looking and going, why are we still stuck with this design from the film camera days when we haven't made a film camera in decades? Let's get rid of the mirror, which takes out these mechanical components that could potentially cause failure and replaces them with just an electronic viewfinder. So now there's no mirror that's flipping up. So you're either exposing the image or you're looking through it. On DSLRs, when you take a photo, the viewfinder that you're looking through with your eye will black out because the mirror moves and you can't see. So with a mirrorless camera, the image shouldn't be blacking out while you're taking the photo. And because there's no literally mechanical mirror that needs to move up and down, there's less space needed inside the camera. So they could use that space. They could either make cameras smaller, which is what mirrorless cameras were initially known for, was being really compact, or they could fit other stuff in there. You can fit in-body image stabilization. You can fit heat sinks for bigger sensors to dissipate heat. You can put processors. The space that the mirror is taking up could be used for other things or just to make the camera more compact. So that's really the benefit. Like image quality-wise, a really good, like I'm thinking of something like maybe the Canon 6D Mark II, which is still the DSLR that Heather uses on all her videos, versus the R6 Mark II. Just in terms of image quality for photos between those two cameras, the R6 Mark II, which is the mirrorless version of the 6D, probably maybe a little bit better. It's definitely got better autofocus. It has a newer sensor, but I don't think the camera is going to be the limiting factor there. I think the person behind the camera is going to be a way bigger bottleneck in terms of image quality if you're trying to take a good photo with the 6D Mark II versus the R6 Mark II. For video, it's a little different because you have 4K, and autofocus and all that kind of stuff. But for photos, my point in saying that is that pure image quality between a DSLR and a mirrorless camera, one isn't inherently better or worse than the other. Companies have been investing much more in mirrorless lately, so mirrorless cameras have better options now because they're not making DSLRs anymore. And for a lot of companies, like Canon comes to mind, their mirrorless lineups also came with new lens mounts, so they're not making old lenses for old types of cameras, and that kind of is also why those things just sort of shut down. So ultimately, if you're looking at DSLR, if you're looking for a camera and you see a camera that has a lot of the features you want and it happens to be a DSLR, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You might be able to get something at an amazing price. Even though a lot of new lenses aren't being made for those, you still have a lot of existing lens models out there, and there's a lot of supply that's still out there, and there's used lenses and stuff. So it's not necessarily the worst idea in the world to get a DSLR depending on your needs, but it's definitely not going to be the most modern thing. So if you're really looking for budget and features and trying to maximize stuff, especially if you're trying to get maybe a full frame camera for the cheapest price, you might want to look into a DSLR. But all things being equal, I would definitely consider DSLRs to be dead and move into mirrorless because that's where everything is moving. Now, Micro Four Thirds. This is where I don't feel like I'm going to get angry letters or messages for this episode. I feel like it might be about the Micro Four Thirds because Micro Four Thirds has such a dedicated fan base, does such a dedicated user base. Micro Four Thirds is a lens mount. It's sort of hard to explain. Let me think of how to explain Micro Four Thirds. What it is a different lens mount and a different sensor size. So you have full frame, you have crop, and then you have Micro Four Thirds. Where things get a little weird is Micro Four Thirds, the lens mount, isn't necessarily manufacturer specific. So you can find a Micro Four Thirds mount on different manufacturers' cameras, which is actually pretty sweet because that means you can use same lenses across different systems. But the sensor is smaller than a crop sensor. Crop sensor is also called APS-C. So it's almost like the equivalent. This is probably not exact, but you have a full frame sensor, and then you have that crop sensor, which is like a 1.6 times crop. Micro Four Thirds is almost like that same equivalent crop step down into the crop sensor. So it's a smaller sensor, but they're mirrorless cameras. There are people over the years, Micro Four Thirds probably started popping up around, I don't know, maybe around 2011-ish, 2012-ish, sort of in there. And a lot of people love them. A lot of people still use them. I would 100% call Micro Four Thirds dead at this point. But it's a little trickier than that because of I think the enthusiasm and the passion that people have for it, and the insanely good value that it can be, because some of the cameras and the lenses have so many good features at such good prices. Even still, the whole reason for Micro Four Thirds was to sort of be a stopgap as mirrorless cameras were still developing. So I give Canon a lot of grief for like their overheating and all this kind of stuff. And the reason I do that is because they basically waited until they released the EOS R in 2018, which was a good camera, not full frame 4K, but otherwise a great, great camera. And then when they tried to really, really dive into mirrorless, they waited until 2020 and then had all these like beginner problems like overheating and battery life and just all this stupid stuff that they should have sorted out by that point. But if we go back in time more to like 2014, I'm going to look at when Sony came out with the A7 originally. I think that was 2014, maybe 2013. It was like their first full frame mirrorless camera. It had so many problems too. It had no battery life. It overheated after like 4 minutes, like tons of problems with it because it was this full frame mirrorless camera. And, people still loved it though, because you could get 4K on a full frame sensor. The low light capability was insane, but you were just figuring out workarounds after workarounds. There was no autofocus basically. And that was a reason why I never then looked at Sony cameras again for so long. So I was like, wow, what a mess. My Canon is so reliable. I'm just going to do this. And over the years, every time Sony released a new camera, they were able to iterate and change and improve until the point where they were creating cameras that were more reliable than Canon could. And Canon rested on their laurels a bit, kind of just stuck with DSLRs, didn't pay attention to mirrorless. By the time they were like, oh my God, we're getting eaten alive by the mirrorless market, then they started putting out cameras. But then they had to go back and figure out, oh, how do we deal with overheating? How do we deal with battery life and autofocus and all this stuff? So that whole thing of trying to put a big sensor in a mirrorless camera causes a lot of problems. And so a big solution to that was to not use a big sensor. Even at the time, crop sensor cameras, like a crop sensor mirrorless camera, it's not just that the sensor is big, it's that bigger sensor with more resolution requires so much more processing power. That's one of the big things that generates heat, which is why cameras will start overheating. It also just needs, not to generate heat, but you need processors, tiny computers on the camera that can handle all of that information coming in so many times a second. And that is a difficult thing to design, I'd imagine. I have no idea how to create something like that, but I'm guessing it's difficult. And so a solution was to use smaller sensors. If we use a smaller sensor, it's not going to need as much processing power. It's not going to generate as much heat. It's going to be so much more manageable. That is Micro Four Thirds. So what's really crazy about Micro Four Thirds is some of the features and functionality on those cameras. The prices are much lower, but the features and functionality are things that like full frame mirrorless cameras are kind of just in the last year or two starting to get. Micro Four Thirds cameras have had for like 8 years. If you look at something like the Panasonic GH5, I don't know when the GH5 came out, maybe 2016-ish. If you look at the GH4, which I think came out in 2013, maybe 2014, they don't have good autofocus. But the GH5 specifically, it's like super good resolution, crazy good video quality, not amazing low light performance because the sensor is so small, but still good low light performance, no overheating, no record limits, full size HDMI out, like all of these features that people wanted on full frame mirrorless cameras for a long time. These Micro Four Thirds cameras just had them. Wait, the GH5 is Micro Four Thirds. Am I wrong? Hang on a second. Okay. I had to take a Google break. It's like, wait a minute, because it did seem too good to be true. No, the Panasonic GH5 is a Micro Four Thirds system camera designed with high quality video production as the primary goal, from Panasonic.com. Because the other thing is, it looks like a big beefy DSLR or mirrorless camera. So some of them were very small and very compact, but some of them got really beefy and really capable. And for very obvious reasons, those cameras became very, very popular. You had all these features, all this capability for a low price. They're super reliable. I mean, why wouldn't you want that? And so people built up their Micro Four Thirds camera collections, lens collections, and there's still a dedicated group of Micro Four Thirds users, but companies really kind of aren't like making them or supporting them anymore. So Micro Four Thirds lenses, there's not really a lot of new stuff happening there. Companies like, Panasonic's not making Micro Four Thirds new cameras anymore because they can make really reliable full frame cameras and crop sensor cameras at this point. So like the need for Micro Four Thirds isn't there the way that it used to be, but the people who found those cameras and loved them are still there, and the cameras are so good, they're still working just fine. So, there's no need to like throw it out or anything. All that to say, if you're looking for a new camera and you're trying to figure out, okay, there's full frame, there's crop sensor, somebody told me about Micro Four Thirds, what about that? I wouldn't recommend looking into it just because you would be jumping into a dead system. You might find an amazing deal, you might get something you want, that's awesome, but if you're looking for longevity or to be as future-proof as you can be in anything related to technology, Micro Four Thirds probably not the way to go. And the same goes, honestly, with just finding the cheapest thing possible. So you might go to, say you go to B&H Photo or something, and you want to look up a camera and you just sort the results by lowest price to highest price, and you just see whatever the cheapest price is. Let me do that right now, actually. I will go to B&H Photo. Let's go to photography. Let's click on digital cameras and let's sort by price lowest to highest. So the cheapest one is a $43 Vivitar camera. That's not going to be fun to use. I'm going to try to find like the cheapest, I don't want to call it an actual camera, but an actual camera. So yeah, okay, you've got like a Kodak digital camera for $189. You can get cameras for a couple $100. I'm trying to see what like the cheapest Canon or something would be. The problem with these is they look nice. On paper, they might even have some of the features that you want. They're going to be so limiting and so frustrating to use. Whatever money you save in your wallet, you're going to end up paying double in frustration and probably a lack of motivation. It's almost, guitars are a really good example. Guitars and instruments. You can give a really good guitar player a cheap $90 guitar that probably isn't the highest quality, probably doesn't feel the best, and they'll be able to make it sound good. You could take that same $90 guitar, give it to a beginner, and probably unless they're super motivated, in a couple months, they're not going to be playing guitar anymore because it's not going to necessarily super encourage them. They don't need a $10,000 custom shop guitar to be encouraged, but there's that nice middle ground of, maybe a higher end Squire or a low end Mexican Fender or something maybe $400 or $500. That's going to be a thing that is going to grow with them. They're not going to outgrow it, and it's going to be high quality enough and enjoyable enough to use that it's not going to discourage them from continuing on. I say that from experience as my $90 first guitar sits behind me on the wall. So I think a camera is very similar. If you just get the cheapest one out there, even if you're like, oh my gosh, it's got all these features, it has, right now I'm looking, the cheapest DSLR I can find is the Canon Rebel T100, which comes with a lens for $380, full HD video, an 18 megapixel sensor. It's basically better than the DSLR I started out with, and it's fine, but you're very quickly going to wish you had other features. You're very quickly going to outgrow it. You're very quickly going to probably get frustrated with it. The more frustrated you are, you're not going to think, oh, my camera's what's frustrating. You're going to think cameras are frustrating. I'm not into this. Put it in a drawer, set it on a shelf, totally forget about it, and never move on from there. So it's worth investing in something that's going to meet your needs and also encourage you. So I wouldn't recommend like those just cheapest options out there. Also, because phones are so good, like don't spend $400 on a camera, because just use your phone. like you're going to get better results. It's going to be easier and more encouraging. Save up the money and put it towards there. So my actual recommendations, if you want specific recommendations, if that's what you've been waiting for the whole time, here are a few of them. Of course, depending on when you're listening to this, you might want to check that these are still relevant. But in general, a camera body, companies seem to update their camera bodies every 3 to 4 years. They don't update all the time. Lenses are updated much, much less often. So it's not uncommon as you go on to end up with a lens collection. Somebody said marry your lenses and date your camera. That might be kind of a crude way to put it, but kind of, yeah. You'll probably end up building a lens collection that you keep, and you'll swap out camera bodies. That's why you see I'm switching videos from people, because it's not just I'm using a different camera. There's this whole infrastructure of like lenses and other accessories that are system specific. And so if you want to go from Canon to Sony or something, there's so much more to it if you've been heavily invested in one system to another to make that leap. So that's definitely why it's worth looking at a system as a whole and seeing like, do I like where this company is going? Do I like what they have? Does it seem like they're going to, serve me as a customer into the future? That's probably a good thing to do. Otherwise, if you're looking at a camera that's a year or two old, it's, that's fine. It's totally fine. So my number one recommendation that I've been giving to everybody for a while now looking into cameras is the Sony ZV-E10, which is a crop sensor interchangeable lens mirrorless camera. You can get it with a lens for about $800. It comes in black or white. There is a $700 version that doesn't come with a lens. Any Sony E-mount lens will work on it. So from the cheapest to the most expensive, you can pop that lens on that camera and it'll work. The reason I also like the Sony lens system is because you have Tamron and Sigma options, which there's a lot to work with there. But the ZV-E10 specifically, it's got a flip out screen. I would call it a hybrid camera. It's a very small, very compact mirrorless camera. It does photo and it does video. Maybe it leans a little more towards video. It's definitely maybe a bit more of like a vlogging camera, but it's a great still photo camera too. Like it's a 24 megapixel sensor. You're going to get great photos from it. It's got incredible autofocus for both photo and video. It has a 4K sensor, so it is a crop sensor, but you're shooting in 4K. There's no overheating. There's no recording time limits. It does have a micro HDMI output because it's such a small camera, but you can send your HDMI signal out there. And it can just be used as a USB webcam right out of the box. So you have sort of a lot of really cool functionality just built right into the ZV-E10. And the lens that it comes with, that $800, it comes with a 16 to 50 millimeter lens, which is a great kit lens. You'll probably want to move on to something, relatively quickly with any camera, but that's a usable kit lens. It's going to be, you're going to get encouraging results from it. You're going to like, hey, I really like this camera. It looks really good. And then you might find your lens specifications. I typically recommend, especially if people want to do a lot of video and stuff, pairing the ZV-E10 with the Sigma 16 millimeter 1.4, which is a really nice prime lens that it's $350, $400. It's not like dirt cheap, but in the world of lenses is pretty cheap. And that's a very usable focal length for, you'd end up with a frame, like a field of view that kind of looks like my normal talking headshot for YouTube videos. And it's a great prime lens. That prime lens won't work on full frame cameras. So that's, kind of an important thing to know. You can always get, the 50 millimeter 1.8 if you want to play around with the prime lens at the lowest price possible. And there's cool stuff out there. So the ZV-E10 is my number one recommendation. I wouldn't go below that. That's $800. So if you want to spend less than $800 on a camera, I would suggest that you don't. Unless you need a specific camera like a GoPro, which is like $400 or something, or a 360 camera. Those are very specialized. But if you're looking at an interchangeable lens camera, you're like, but Tom, the ZV-E10's $800. Here's this other thing for $400 or $500. You're going to get frustrated by the other thing, whereas the ZV-E10, you will be the bottleneck. And that's what you want. You want to be the bottleneck for your equipment and your gear. You don't want it to bottleneck you. And the ZV-E10 is a great camera. I have no need for one, but I've used it, but I don't own one, and I keep wanting to get one, but I have no need for it. But I keep wanting to get one just because it's such a cool little camera. It's a great, great camera. So the ZV-10 is my number one recommendation. From there, there's definitely some other stuff you could look at, especially from other companies. Trying to go in terms of price here. So I have a little list going here. I want to make sure to look at a little bit of everything. So from there, you could jump up into Canon has a few things. They have the R50, which they just came out with, and that is a crop sensor mirrorless camera. And that's a little more expensive than the Sony ZV-E10, but seems by all accounts to be a great camera. It's almost, I don't know if this is totally fair, but it seems like it's Canon's version of the ZV-E10. And that's important to know because if you're somebody who wants to go into the Canon side of things, which Canon is great, like all the grief I give, Canon cameras are great. If you want to go in the Canon side of things, the R50 might be a really good jumping in point for that. Canon also recently released the R8, the rate, the Canon rate, which has a going rate of $1,700. So it's more expensive, but it is a full frame camera. So for $1,700, you can get a full frame mirrorless camera with a, a 24 to 50 millimeter kit lens. So if you want to jump into full frame, you could do that on the Canon side of things. And then in the Canon world, you could jump up to something like the R6 Mark II, and then the R5 goes from there, and then you jump into the cinema cameras and stuff. But those are many thousands of dollars more expensive. If you're looking at like under $2,000 for a camera and a lens, the Canon R50 is a good place to start. The Canon R8 is a good place to start. On the Sony side of things, you have the ZV-E10, which is under $1,000. You have the Sony A7C, which it's a very interesting camera. I know if Gil's listening to this, he has two A7Cs. Basically what they did is they took the sensor from the A7 III, which had been out for a while, but was a hugely popular camera, especially for video. It's a really good hybrid camera for photo and video. And they took that sensor and those guts and they put it in a smaller, more compact body with a flip out screen. So the A7C is a little more compact, but it is full frame and it does have a flip out screen. And I think really the biggest downside is the autofocus isn't quite what the newer Sonys are. But it's still really good, and the cameras are a little bit more affordable. What is the A7C? Okay, by a little more affordable, $1,700. The tricky part, though, is then at that price range, the reason I'm bringing up the A7C is because it does go on sale more often, so it is like $1,600 or $1,700, but I've seen it around $1,400. If you're going to $1,600, and it is full frame, if you don't need full frame, the Sony FX30, $1,800, and you get a Sony quote unquote cinema series camera. You get the FX3 with a different sensor inside of it. And that is a really amazing camera. It can do photos, but especially if you want video, you have a lot of, full size HDMI, a more video ergonomic centered body. Like you have a lot more functionality towards video. So the FX30 it's very like Sony kind of just dropped the mic on everyone with the FX30, especially if you're somebody who's open to a crop sensor camera. Sometimes crop sensor called APS-C, sometimes Super 35. So if you hear those terms, that's what we're talking about. There's also the Blackmagic cameras, which are like the 6K Pro, the 6K, and the 6K Pro. Those are amazing. If you don't mind manual focus, you don't mind figuring out ways to record, like to connect external hard drives to record, and you're somebody who's going to be behind the camera more than in front of it, that might be where the Blackmagics come into play. Nikon has some cool stuff like the Z5 and the Z6. You can get some really nice, full frame mirrorless cameras for under $2,000 if you want to go into the Nikon world. Nikon has been the slowest, the slowest of the big companies to embrace the world of mirrorless, but over the past few years, they've really kicked things up a bit. I got to use the Z9 for a while, and they're great. So if you're somebody who likes, Nikon colors, or maybe you even have some, I don't know if the older Nikon lenses work on the mirrorless one, so don't quote me on that. If you want a Nikon is a viable choice in the mirrorless world, and they have some options. Specifically, I would look at the Z5 and the Z6. There are other things now, like the, I was going to jump into the Sony A7 IV, which is about $2,400, and that's Sony's. That's got to be one of their most popular cameras. It's a full frame hybrid camera. It's, not the best photo camera in the world, not the best video camera in the world, but it's really, really good at everything, even though it's not the best at anything. And yeah, I love my A7 IV. It's a good camera, and judging by how well they sell and how popular they are, other people think so too. The Sony lens system and what's available is really great also. So the A7 IV, you can't go wrong with that one. But I also wanted to point out, I could not make this episode without talking about the Panasonic S5 II, which is a newly released full-frame mirrorless camera from Panasonic. It is $2,000, full-frame camera that is kind of, I'm sort of trying to look at some of the key features here. It's a very video-centric camera. You can do photos with it, of course, but they kind of pulled out all the stops in terms of resolutions and thing. You can do 6K. I think it might even have some kind of 8K built in. But the biggest thing here for the S5 II is not only do you have this like very fully featured full frame camera for under $2,000, but it actually has decent autofocus. Not on the level of Sony, not on the level of Canon, but maybe on the level of Sony and Canon like 4 years ago, which is still really good. Like, I'd be wondering if my EOS R and the S5 II, I would bet the S5 II's autofocus is better than my EOS R's. And my EOS R's is pretty dang good. So that is Panasonic's first, like, we have autofocus now camera. And so if you want to dive into the world of Panasonic, now there's sort of a better entry point. And the thing that's nice about that is Panasonic really embraces video more than almost any of the other companies do. Sony does a great job with their video-centric cameras, but Panasonic does not seem shy about just packing their cameras filled with video-centric features. And at this price for this camera, it's pretty amazing. So there's definitely a worthy thing to look at there in the world of the Panasonic. And then, of course, you know, in the world of Sony, the A7S III is still going strong. It feels like an old camera now, even though like there's nothing that has replaced it. It's only 2.5 years old. It's not old. There's probably still going to be another year or two before there's a replacement, I would think. The only downside to the A7S III, I love the A7S III. That's the one that hooked me on Sony. If you want a video-centric workflow, it's definitely the way to go because there's never any overheating issues. There's no rolling shutter. Same with the FX3. The FX3 is just more expensive. You have full frame 4K 120. The only thing is that Sony has been terrible about firmware updates for the A7S III. It's a very, like, the thing with that is, you know, you look at Canon, they have new firmware updates all the time for their cameras, but especially for like the R5, a lot of those firmware updates were to get it to be on the level that the A7S III just was from the beginning. So it's like, well, Canon does all these firmware updates and Sony doesn't do any. It's like, well, they didn't need to. Like, the camera was fine. Canon had to make their camera fine. But in the time since, newer, cheaper Sony cameras have come out that have pretty awesome features that there's no reason the more expensive, higher end model of the A7S III shouldn't also have and could be added through firmware, but they're not adding it there, and that's really disappointing. There's been a pretty decent firmware update for the FX3. There have been some minor updates for the A7 IV, and I think there's another one about to come out soon for the A7 IV. And the A7S III, for some reason, Sony is just like kind of ignoring it, and that sucks. It's an amazing camera. Like, you will not be sorry if you get the A7S III, but it's very frustrating that they're not supporting it. That was like my one thing when I was jumping into the world of Sony. I loved it so much and everything seemed so perfect. And the one thing I said was the big test is going to be how they support their cameras with firmware updates into the future. And I had a lot of high hopes, and that's the kind of the area I've been disappointed is how randomly and like not effectively Sony implements firmware updates into their cameras. So definitely, I guess all that to say, when you buy a Sony camera, don't buy it thinking like they might add this in the future, they could add that or bring this feature here. Buy it for what it is, and if they add stuff or change stuff in the future, that's a bonus. And this probably goes with anything, not just a Sony camera. But Sony has a bad track record with firmware updates, but otherwise they're pretty great. So those are my specific recommendations, kind of ranging from the least expensive up to the mid range. We're talking $2,500 to $3,000. Some of those suggestions there, and beyond that, I feel like you might know what you're doing if you're going to drop $4,000 on a camera, hopefully, or more. But yeah, the world of cameras is really fun. The area where most people hurt themselves is by trying to just be as cheap as possible. Definitely don't make the mistake of ignoring lenses. It's totally okay to get a camera, dive into a camera, not know anything about lenses, but fully expect that if you get into it, you will be interested in lenses and probably wanting to invest in lenses in the future. And it's not uncommon at all at a certain point to have more money invested in your lenses than your camera, to keep your lenses longer than you keep your camera body and all that. So as you're looking for a system to dive into, it's probably a good idea to just see how many other options there are, what other options there are for lenses. And then the biggest thing, speaking from my own experience and all my recommendations aside, is to look at your very specific needs, your non-negotiables, and then see what is available that meets those needs, and then get what's best for you. Don't just get a type of camera or a brand of camera because somebody else uses, because I use it or because somebody else does or somebody told you to. Really look at your needs, get what's best for you, and then I think you'll probably be happiest as long as you get something from one of the main companies. And don't put too much pressure on yourself either. Like ultimately buy from a place like I've been talking about B&H Photo, buy from a place that has a good return policy. If you get a camera and it's really not working out for you, return it and get a different option instead. If you can rent cameras, go to lens rentals or something and try out a camera. The downside to that is, if you spend $150 to rent a camera and then you decide you want it, now you're spending the price of the camera to buy plus the $150 you spent to rent it. So that's kind of a bummer. Lens rentals will let you you can rent it and then you can keep it. You pay to keep it. You just buy the camera from them, but their prices are not good. Like you're getting a used thing and you're paying like more than full price for it. So I wouldn't really recommend that. But the rental prices are great. But yeah, to do what works for you, don't put too much stress on yourself though. If you're getting basically any Sony camera, any Canon, any Panasonic, any Nikon, any Fuji, you're going to be happy with it. It's going to be a good camera. You're going to be the bottleneck, and that's great because then it's just up to you to practice, to build your skills, and to learn more about it. So that is what we're talking about with cameras today. Next week, we're going to do a Q&A episode. It's already episode 5. It's already the midway point of season 9, and so that's going to be a Q&A episode. If you're listening to this before that episode comes out, definitely keep an eye on like my Instagram and YouTube stuff, all the social medias, because that's where I put out the call for questions. Of course, if you just want to submit something, I know I already have a couple in there. You can go to himynameistom.com and submit a voice submission through the little link that's right there, or you can just email something to tom@enthusiasmproject.com. You don't have to wait until I ask for a question. You can do that anytime, and I'll be sure to touch on all of those questions next week in the Q&A episode. Otherwise, I hope this was helpful. I hope it maybe pointed you in the right direction towards cameras. Definitely check out the lens video, and I will see you next time. No, that's not how my outro goes. I don't say I see you next time first. First, I say I hope you have a safe, happy, healthy, fun rest of your week, and I will see you next time.